Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panels. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I'm the Communications Director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. Thank you all so much for taking the time to be with us here today. Today we are discussing another fascinating and really important topic around autonomous vehicle technology, and that is the chips that make it all happen. We will be covering everything from sort of the role that chips play in the cars that are on the road today, some of the supply chain issues you may have been reading about, but then really talking about sort of how this really critical part of the supply chain is going to need to evolve going into the increasingly automated age. Joining us today to discuss this topic are two wonderful experts who have agreed to share their deep knowledge of this with us. First, from the Center for Automotive Research, we have President and CEO Carla Bailo. Carla, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here.
We're also joined by Bettina Weiss. She's the Chief of Staff and Corporate Strategy at Semi Global. Bettina, welcome.
Thank you. Hello, everybody.
Yeah, and so let's start today by kind of helping people understand sort of the status quo of the role that chips sort of play in cars today. And Bettina, I was hoping you could help me with this. Just can you quantify the importance of microelectronics, I guess, more broadly in cars today? Sort of how big of a part of each of these vehicles, since they're kind of hidden from the consumer, how important are they to modern vehicles?
The short answer is increasingly important. So the current bill of materials for electronics in cars is at about 20%, which means about 40% of value of a vehicle. So it's pretty substantial. And these electronics and these chips and other devices sit very often in kind of mundane places of the car, but also very sensitive places of the car, for safety and security, for example. So it's not just your tire pressure sensor, it is also your airbag deployer and other safety measures. But it's an increasingly important issue, and that's really what's brought car and semi together. And it's also what's bringing the entire supply chain together, chips and cars. Yeah.
And Carla, can you help us understand sort of, one of the things that's been discussed a lot in this sort of supply chain crisis really is that, there's more overlap with these chips between the auto industry and other industries that people kind of more easily understand that chips are really important to them. Can you help us understand this relationship, like between the chips that are in cars and the chips that go into electronics or gaming consoles or things like that?
Sure. First, let me talk about the difference between the two. The automotive industry has very different specifications in general from all of the other chips that are going into your smart devices, be it your laptop or your iPad or your cell phone or your smart dishwasher or whatever you have that's smart. And these days, almost everything is smart, let's face it. And that's actually what's kind of snowballed some of this problem. But when you think about the durability requirements, the temperature extremes that a vehicle needs to see, and you need to have that kind of robustness in the product, that means, that our chips are different. You can't just take a smart washing machine chip and put it in a car. The specs are totally different. But that has been, part of the reason why we've experienced the problem that we have is there's only X number of suppliers of chips. And, during the pandemic, the need or the necessity for, all the devices you needed to work from home for your kids to learn school at home, it just went exponentially. So the number of smart devices exploded, compounded with, all your other devices in your household becoming smart, and almost everything that you have now has a chip in it of some sort. So, and there's only X number of manufacturers that make them. So once we cut the supply during the pandemic, because first we didn't know we were going to reopen, that creates this long window of when these parts can be available again, because you get out of the supply chain queue, so to speak. And it can be 4 to 6 months to get back into it and get those parts back into your manufacturing plant. So, there's a vast disparity between the different chips, and we've just had an explosion in terms of demand.
Yeah, and Bettina, but so even though these chips are very different, right? So a consumer grade chip and an automotive grade chip, and we've done a weekly virtual panel on automotive grade, which you can go to our YouTube library if you want to dig into that topic a little bit more. But sort of the process is the same, right? So like the core silicon oftentimes of these are the same. So even though maybe, you know, one wafer might become a consumer grade chip, one might become an automotive chip, they're both coming from the same place. So is that sort of where some of this bottleneck is coming from, is sort of higher up the supply chain? Is that right?
Fundamentally, you're right. There is a process of manufacturing a chip from raw silicon all the way to packaging and into the system. The semiconductor industry operates at almost 100% utilization and 100% capacity. There's not a lot of wiggle room in a good time. So the pandemic really accelerated, as Carla mentioned, you know, the spike in demand for home office devices. It was very difficult to get a laptop too. It's not that the shortage just hit the automotive industry, right? But it was particularly acute, obviously, in automotive. And the semiconductor industry just couldn't pivot back when auto production came up again, because capacity was kind of shifted and spoken for, right? So to alleviate that, I can share with you that we have a lot of capacity coming online over the next couple, 3 years, but it's not going to be enough to really help with this current and very acute problem. But to your question, yes, there's one process. The chip makers very often make multiple chips. There are very few discrete ones like Samsung, you know, that only make memory or DRAM or other devices. But most of the fabs make mixed devices.
Yeah,
I'm sorry, Ed. I think it's also important to note that, you know, mobility is comprised of many different devices. So, you know, the ag industry is very smart these days, with more chips going into, you know, tractors and combines than ever before. And also the boating industry, every form of mobility is fighting for these chips. The specs are still different for each one. So that's, you know, what complicates a lot of the supply chain.
Yeah,
absolutely. And I want to get into the role that automated driving is playing here too, but can you maybe give us a sense of sort of how long does it take to kind of, you know, get through something like this, to bring new capacity online, to work through a problem because you know, certainly with cars, right, if you're at 100% utilization, you have to build a whole new factory. I mean, we're talking about, you know, years and years and years to bring new capacity in auto. Is chip making similarly constrained? Are they a little bit more flexible? What does that look like?
Yes and no. It is a huge and very, very expensive undertaking to build a semiconductor fab. I mean, we're talking close to $10 billion sometimes for an advanced semiconductor fab. From groundbreaking or greenfield to actually volume production, that's several years. But they're not coming on in chunks, right? Or they're not coming on in a linear fashion. I'm sorry, the capacity is coming on in chunks. So that's not helpful maybe in the very moment, but it is going to make it better. We're thinking towards the second half of 2022, when we see the first few lines either expanding or opening up in new fabs. We have, I think, close to 80 200 and 300 millimeter semiconductor fabs coming on in the next 4 years or 3.5 years. That's a huge chunk of capacity. So it will get better. And what this has done also in a good way is has really facilitated and encouraged the dialogue between car manufacturers and the semiconductor community, saying, how can we please not repeat this, right? And that means conversation and learning.
Yeah, and so I think you know, that's that's a huge amount of capacity that you just mentioned coming online. The flip side of that, of course, is, as you mentioned, cars are using more and more chips all the time, right? So supply is growing, but demand is growing as well. Carla, can you just help us understand what is the impact specifically with increased automated driving? And in this, I mean, not just fully autonomous vehicles, but also, the increasingly ubiquitous driver assistance systems that you see on the road. What is the impact of that on the demand for chips that the auto industry is going to face going forward?
Well, it clearly has a huge increase to the amount of chips that we're going to need. First, there's the ADAS systems, which are, of course, chip dependent, and those are going to be installed in basically 100% of the vehicles. That's very much a part of the Infrastructure Act. Included as well is the systems to detect distracted driving and or under the influence driving. So that's another one of those systems that's going to require chips. And then as you move into electrification, that is going to make about 40 to 50% of the vehicle value or bill of materials being electronic or in some way related to electronics. As you move into it, advanced driving and perhaps even into autonomy, that number again increases drastically. And it really depends, how you run your algorithms, how you connect your systems in terms of actual numbers. Yeah. It's going to be somewhere in the 2,000 to 3,000 range, might even be more. And that's an increase. And Bettina, correct me, but I think in the average vehicle today, it's around 500-600.
Yeah.
So,
yeah,
I mean, it's about 4 or 5 times what we have today. So I think the other part of, we're talking about building more capacity. We know that there is the $52 billion CHIPS Act that is being discussed at the moment on the Hill to be able to do more manufacturing of chips on our shores and provide incentives for that. I think that's one thing that is sorely needed. But even if it passes, it'll be probably in 4 or 5 years before we'll see anything, on the ground running. So a lot of automakers are starting to hedge their bets, as you know, and forming their own partnerships to be able to have their own supply.
Yeah. And if I could just add to that, this really points to, first of all, a global supply chain and a very interdependent supply chain. And automotive and semiconductor are increasingly intertwined, right? The fact that the lack of availability for a 5-cent microcontroller can paralyze a car maker, right? Pretty much, it's a tiny little device that is mass produced, but if you can't get it, you can't get your cars off the conveyor belt. That is a scary prospect. So the CHIPS Act is great, and we very much support it, and we hope it'll happen. But other markets and other supply chain stakeholders will come to the table as well and invest and help stabilize the entire value chain.
And Ed, let me throw another monkey wrench out there that we all need to be thinking about seriously. Vehicles are just becoming computers on wheels. It kills me to say that as an automotive person, but it's very true. And that means people's acceptance of updates, waiting for minor model change or the next model, is going to become very impatient. So product life cycles are going to get shorter and shorter. Yeah. And that may mean updates and increasing numbers of chips needed to be able to facilitate that increased capacity over the life of that vehicle. So it's going to just continue to be, just a squeeze play, so to speak, to have enough chips.
Yeah. So you've mentioned electrification, you mentioned automated driving, and now over-the-air updates. 3 of the more significant technology trends certainly in the sector, and they're all just increasing the need for chips. Now, in light of sort of this continued pressure, the fact that automakers are now going and really more actively, oftentimes seeking out partnerships, is sort of vertical integration one of the pieces of this. And we have examples of some automakers who have either made chips or said that they're going to start making chips. Is that a trend that's going to be here to stay, and how does that play into this whole situation?
Yeah, I'll address that first, Bettina, if that's fine.
Sure.
It's all in the realm of risk management and future proofing, fundamentally. And each automaker is going to take a look at all of the various raw materials, components, et cetera, that they're going to need to make the transition to electrification, and then to correspondingly move on into autonomous vehicles. As they look at that, they're going to have to decide, do I want to bring this in-house and have my own source, so like the old Keiretsu way, or am I going to continue to be dependent on somebody else? And each manufacturer may choose a different route, but I can guarantee you they're all looking at this risk mitigation and all making, contingency plans, how to best handle this.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Bettina, what are sort of the pros and cons of supply chain versus doing it yourself more?
Do it yourself. Well, I think the cost is exorbitant to bring this in-house, to make your own chips. It is really, really expensive. And I think the risk is to then actually, you have to build your own supply chain too, right? To get it packaged, to get it embedded, to get it, even into the car. So I don't know if I would be skeptical for this trend to continue, just because it's so cost prohibitive. And it actually, I would think, isolates a car manufacturer more than it integrates it into the global supply chain. We've seen, more of interesting strategic partnerships, much more flexible and agile collaboration models that are popping up, have been over the past few years, certainly before the pandemic as well. I see that as maybe a more sustainable model for the future. Everybody's talking about shrinking the time window between generations. Everybody is very acutely aware of that. Everybody knows it's increasingly a software play, right? So I think in partnership, you might be able to even accelerate that development time, but you don't have this huge risk of producing your own chips and have them contract manufactured, basically, right?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah, I think you have to decide if it's your core competency or not. If you're going to bring it in-house and do everything yourself, you probably don't have that skill set internally. So how are you going to get that? By partnering with others or whatever. And as we look at how to do, the automotives are good at doing certain things and not good at doing others. And what Bettina says, having those partnerships is key. It's interesting when you look at how some of the different automakers have managed throughout this crisis. And it goes back in a lot of cases to relationships with the supplier. And it's really putting the spotlight on, are your suppliers partners to you, or do you just get parts from the lowest bidder? And we've seen, the companies that have actually done pretty well, and we've seen the companies that have had trouble. And if you correlate that to the supplier surveys, the satisfaction surveys, they're kind of aligned. So, I think all the automakers need to think about how they're treating their suppliers and work to really facilitate those relationships so that they can rely on those relationships in times of turmoil.
Yeah,
I think that explains the degree of bitterness that some tier ones have expressed, because they were just caught holding the bag in some cases, right? They had all the risk, and then they're sitting on inventory that nobody wanted for a long time. So that was tough. I think we've seen, to Carla's point, if you invest as a car maker, if you invest in your supply chain, your supplier community, and actually have a stake in these companies, you tend to have more transparency, and you tend to have better planning processes that are integrated, and that usually yields better results. Yeah, so it's very true. It also mitigates risk because it spreads the risk, right?
Yeah, it is. And because collaboration seems to be emerging as such an important theme in this, is also sort of there a certain amount of starting to work earlier in the design phase. Because I know certainly in the past, these supplier relation challenges have always been with us in the auto industry, right? And in the past, it wasn't necessarily chips, it was other kinds of suppliers, but that choice of, you're either just a customer or you're truly a partner has been a real ongoing theme. And so I was just wondering, in the past, sort of working together earlier in the design process has been one of the ways that become more partners. Is that something that's happening here too? Or is it because chips are sort of different? Is there less scope for that?
I think there's many factors that are involved there. Typically, a lot of your new innovations bring the suppliers in very early into the product development cycle because you need full validation of whatever the new item is you're putting in the car for the first time. Otherwise, they tend to wait till the last minute to source, and they're not part of that design development integration process. But, I mentioned before about design cycles getting shorter, customers getting impatient. When you're going to bring a total, design change down to 12 to 18 months, like the electronics industry, you've got to be working with a lot of people early, or you're just not going to be ready. So I think we're going to see more integration further upstream in the future, when the vehicle is mainly just a software device. It's going to become very, very important to get those design specs and get that support in the very beginning. The consumer is going to choose a vehicle in the future based on their experience in that vehicle, and that experience is handled through human machine interface, how the software systems collaborate and help them with their lives. And we got to do this right in the beginning. As we saw in the latest JD Power scores, the #1 complaint right now in vehicles is the software systems. Number one, because unfortunately we make them too darn complex. The average customer doesn't want to go through 4 screens to change their heated seat. We have to make it simple, and who knows better than the electronics industry how to do that. So involving them earlier is going to become more critical.
Yeah. So on that note, I mean, I think, a lot of this sort of change in the car industry has been framed as sort of, it's either going to be Detroit or Silicon Valley. And what we've really sort of seen, in my view anyway, is that really it's been, the successes have oftentimes been in with the collaboration between them. And so I kind of want to dig in a little bit more into sort of what can these different worlds learn from each other, because automotive has some very, very specific knowledge that applies to a lot of other things, but then obviously electronics has a totally different perspective. Bettina, sort of where would you see sort of the biggest lessons for each other?
For the chip shortage right now, I think it is very, very obvious that both communities have to learn from one another, and it became very, very obvious how what the lack of understanding is and how the other one works. Both automotive and semiconductor have cycles and cycle times and ways of planning and forecasting, and those are quite different. So I think by adding some transparency and facilitating dialogue between the two communities to say, can we even do a little bit of joint inventory planning, for example? Can we collaborate more and flatten these big demand supply curves that we're seeing right now? I think all this is possible, but we have to learn from one another if we want to prevent something like this in the future. Bigger picture, if I may, ironically, we started a supply chain engagement platform before the pandemic in like 2017-18 to bring together the semiconductor community and the automotive community. And we still have that council today in 5 regions. And it is interesting looking back that a lot of the things that prompted the formation of this group are playing out today, right? So what organizations like HAR and SEMI and many, many others can do, I think, is really encourage and facilitate this dialogue that needs to happen.
I think where the industries can really think about collaborating is on the specifications. I know that from my experience in industry, oftentimes similar parts have different specs, but that spec is very small in terms of difference. And the supplier can often come to the OE and say, look, if you change this small element, we can reduce the price, we can reduce our complexity, we can make more of them in a batch. So I think this is where the semiconductor industry can really help the automotives and say, look, if you just change this element, you'll be common with blah, 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 and we can make bigger batches, we can reduce the price, but and really, that kind of discussion is needed. So it's that, again, is a different relationship than here's our spec, make it, right? Instead of letting them come back and say, oh, wait a minute, we might have a better idea. And we need to see that kind of collaboration and genuine working relationship on both sides.
Yep, very true.
Absolutely. And I'm wondering too, because it's been fascinating to watch, as you sort of both alluded to earlier, this chip shortage and the supply chain challenges more broadly have not just affected the auto industry, but I feel like when things like this happen, the auto industry is always sort of the main focus in a lot of ways. And I think it's because, as you said, it's amazing that these big multi-billion-dollar companies and industries, can be brought to their knees, or at least temporarily, by the shortage of this one little part. And I'm wondering, has this focus of the auto industry in this broader supply chain and chip crisis, do you think that's sort of help potentially motivate more collaboration, help potentially the chip sector, which again has so many customers in so many spaces and so much growth ahead of it, to kind of recognize that all of these things are important, but like autos are the one that when this doesn't work, that's what everyone's looking at. How do you think that shapes the relationship going forward?
Well, I think it definitely lit a fire underneath it fundamentally, because when you start shutting down manufacturing plants, putting tons of people on layoff, that's a huge issue. Automotive is a huge part of our economic engine in this country. So it's probably one of the, if you're going to illuminate one industry, that's one to do it. And then I think it did prompt then a study of what else? What else? What's next to come? What are we too dependent on other countries to provide us with? What are we short-sighted about for our sustainability in the future? And I think that's dialogue that was desperately needed. And by, highlighting, one of the largest economic contributors to our economy, being shut down and not having enough product, and, all of the other ramifications that have come along with that. I think it did help illuminate many other things, and hopefully we can have serious discussions about improving our supply chain situation.
And again, automotive is a global market, and for many economies, an absolutely vital one. I'm German, right? So Semi is global, so I deal a lot with Europe, with Japan, other Asian countries. And for Germany, of course, just not even Europe, but just Germany, it was so profound, this problem, that, government letters were sent to a large foundry in Taiwan to please, can we have some chips? I mean, it is unbelievable what this cost. So yeah, it just got the limelight because it is such a critical economic factor in many global economies.
Absolutely. Well, we are getting real close to being out of time. I'm wondering if there's any last thoughts that you wanted to just share to kind of sum up the lessons you hope people take away from this. Carla?
Yeah, thanks. I mentioned several. I think relationships are key, and we need to do a better job in our industry of the supplier OE relationship. Make sure there's good communication. Make sure we have a partner relationship. It's not it's not to be taken lightly. And secondly, we've learned supply chain and analysts in supply chain are now the heroes of the industry. They used to be just assumed, but don't take that talent for granted. And the third thing is really take a hard look at future-proofing your organization.
Yeah, that's a good point. From my side, thank you as well. I think the associations and not-for-profits in both the automotive and the semiconductor space, regional and global, have really a mandate to help facilitate the dialogue that I was speaking about, and Carla as well earlier. So I think from PAVE to CAR to SEMI to their equivalents over in Europe and in Japan and elsewhere, should kind of come up with a unified message of how they can help build the platforms that bring these people together and these companies together for, as Carla said, future-proofing the industry. And both supply chains will benefit by working closer together.
Absolutely. Well, thank you both so much to both of our guests for taking the time and sharing their deep experience and knowledge on this topic. Carla Bailo is the president and CEO of Center for Automotive Research. Carla, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you, Ed. It was my pleasure.
And Bettina Weiss is the chief of staff and head of corporate strategy at Semi Global. Bettina, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And thank you for joining today.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, as always, to our audience for taking the time to make automated vehicle education a part of your Wednesday. We really appreciate you being with us today. If you or someone you know was not able to catch the whole conversation, it will be up on our YouTube account. You can follow us on social media at PAVE Campaign or go to www.pavecampaign.org for more. Thank you again. And we hope you've enjoyed this fascinating conversation, and we'll see you again next week for another of PAVE's weekly virtual panels.